hi, everybody. I am Linda Avery, and I'm a recovering Chief Data and Analytics Officer. I have spent 9 years in that role, 5 years at the Federal Reserve and almost 4 years at Verizon, where at Verizon I built an organization of about 1,000 people covering the full gamut of data and AI, ranging from data governance, data architecture, engineering, platform engineering, data science, of course, and also a huge focus on responsible AI. So across these many years of my career, I have had the honor to work with some really great cultures, some very intense cultures, and if I were to describe Goldman Sachs, highly competitive, highly innovative, very driven, very fast-paced, and yet also very consensus-oriented, which made things really interesting when you're trying to drive a strategy in that organization, because you've got to get the consensus with people that don't want to give you the time of day. They're always in a rush, and they have short attention spans. So definitely challenging there. The Federal Reserve as a culture, extremely different. It is probably the most cerebral place I'll ever work. Cautious, as rightly so as a central bank should be. And frankly, I found myself having to write papers at times to be able to move my strategy forward. Very different from Goldman Sachs. And now if you look at Verizon, wasn't expecting to end up in a telco, quite honestly, in my career, but they are as brash as their color is red. Their brand is red. Very execution-oriented, very focused on moving fast, and to boot, they have a lot of consultancies working with them. And so it's a very PowerPoint intensive culture. So again, very different. I didn't find myself doing all that much PowerPoint at Goldman. I maybe could get them to look at 2 slides of mine. You know, if I looked at the Federal Reserve, it was about papers, and Verizon was all about PowerPoint. And I'm bringing this up because it is so important if you're trying to move a strategy forward, and particularly an AI strategy, which is extremely invasive, that you be able to be in tune with the business dialect of where you're working. And that is certainly very important in terms of aligning with the culture. Actually, I won't talk about this right now. I wanted to ask, is anybody here a chief data officer, a chief analytics officer, or some hybrid of that? Got a few of them. Well, you certainly are in the spotlight. You're all in the spotlight right now. So there's been a real sea change, I have to say, in the last year, and you can certainly ascribe some of it to generative AI, but what is beginning to happen is that boards are finally beginning to wake up to the importance of AI in business strategy. It was very interesting. Just a few months ago, I was on a panel, and in preparing for the panel, I was reading through a Deloitte survey that was conducted in August of 2023. And what was amazing to me was that the topic of AI had only appeared in 40% of for the boards at any occurrence. And today, if you take a look at it, there's a huge focus on this. Management teams are also increasingly touting and claiming to be using AI all throughout their businesses, to the point where the SEC is actually coming after firms that are overclaiming what they are doing. So that's an interesting change as well. But with all of the hype and all of the focus on using AI, what's also incredibly interesting is that 74% of CDOs or CAOs do not believe that their roles are well understood. And it's something that they wrestle with every day, because there are other people in the firm that work with technology and data, so who the heck are you? And that certainly is a challenge. I don't know if any of you can relate to the challenge in terms of the teams that you're on, where there's this kind of push and pull in terms of what your identity should be. So this is a really interesting statistic, and I've had some people tell me that it's generous. On average, chief data officers in all their different flavors actually last in their roles for less than 2.5 years. That's pretty remarkable. So why? Well, frankly, there's a lot that can go wrong in this role. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the sins of AI transformation. Starting with the lack of AI literacy. John, you and I were talking about this earlier this morning. It is amazing how non-AI literate many senior executives are, and therefore it's very difficult to get them to engage. There is definitely a tendency to want to basically abdicate responsibility to the technologists. Another major sin is the scope is too broad. People become incredibly ambitious with what they can accomplish. And the reality is that they don't really manage to get anything done that can be measured in tangible value. Or to the other extreme, you've got the focus on pet projects where you've got all these little pockets of data scientists that are strewn across the organization, each working on the pet projects of their boss, which doesn't really add up to anything either. That was certainly the world that I walked into at Verizon, where I actually likened it to fireworks, where people were doing demos left and right, and everybody around the conference room table was going, ooh, ah, and then nothing was actually happening. They couldn't figure out how to integrate the demo into the workflows of the organization. That ties into the next sin, the inability to move beyond experimentation and into actual impact. I'm going to talk about measuring impact in a little bit. The data infrastructure is not primed for AI. We're great at collecting data. We're not very good at connecting data. Focus is too heavy on technology, not in integrating into the processes and moving the people along. Again, that's a cultural issue as well. Minimal focus on risks. That's all over the papers right now in terms of generative AI. And super importantly, the top of the house is not engaged. And that is absolutely huge, because without that, you're going to have organizational dysfunction, and you're not going to be pointing your investments in the right direction. So there's a lot that can go wrong. So the shadow of the leader looms really, really large. And it is incredibly important that you get sponsorship from business leadership if you're going to embark on this journey. And I say this, as I said before, because AI is really invasive. It changes processes, it changes roles, it changes organizations, and it basically changes the game. And so you need to be working with a group of people that are being held accountable on the business side to the business leader in order to get the support and the kind of funding you're going to need. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get that engagement. In addition, you've got to know your business. You've got to understand what your business's crown jewels are. Now, when I say, why am I using that archaic term? What I'm talking about here really is, how does your business see itself as differentiating itself? Is it its ability to price deals? Is it its global intelligence? Is it its client relationship management? And in your role as a data and AI leader, you really have to go deep into where those crown jewels are. And for me, at Verizon, it was the network. Of course, 5G was being rolled out, and I cannot even tell you how intimidating that was for me, having spent my entire career in financial services. I mean, I thought radio heads were a band. I knew nothing about how cellular networks were constructed. And so I basically had to surround myself with people who understood the network, who were network engineers, et cetera, in order just to survive. But I knew, as reluctant as I was to go into this unknown territory, I had to go where the crown jewels were if I was going to have any impact. And boy, did we go deep. We built a digital twin of Verizon's network. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but a digital twin is essentially a virtual representation of an entity, a process, or even a system that responds to stimuli the way that the physical asset would behave. And that's pretty darn intense. And so here I'm just giving you an excerpt of the layers of data that we had to tame in order to stand up this twin, beginning with the 4G and 5G physical equipment, where everything was located, how much it cost to run the network, network utilization, network performance, super important, the environment. Where is this network running? Is it in Houston where the temperatures can go above 100? Or is it in Maine? Very different circumstances. And in addition, market intelligence was incredibly important as well for our digital twin. Is Tesla expanding its plant in Austin, Texas that's going to change traffic patterns? What are the ramifications of losing the major bridge in Baltimore? Where should we put our temporary cellular sites? Et cetera, so that market intelligence was there to inform us in terms of the planning. And then in addition, customer experience, of course, first and foremost, what were our customers thinking of the service that we were providing? So digital twins are amazing. If you were to look at the America's Cup, the boat that won because they had built a digital twin of the hydrofoil. And that was the differentiator in terms of why they won. But what's fascinating is that it really is very much of a journey. I mean, you start off, of course, with the static representation that allows you to understand certain things, and then you move into much more of a real-time understanding where you're predicting, you're prescribing, and for us, the North Star at Verizon was to have a self-managing, self-optimizing, self-correcting network. They're still working on that, by the way. And there's a lot more involved than just the technology, which we're going to get into. But what's particularly interesting was that we were able to use this twin across all kinds of different decisions, whether it was in the planning phase, in the actual build, and also in how we operated the network on a day-to-day basis. And I'm telling you all this because I know that financial services does not leverage digital twins to a large degree as yet, and I'm just trying to expose you to something that was absolutely game-changing for us at Verizon. What was also interesting here is, again, it's not just about what does the network shape like. We have to get a massive workforce of 40,000 people out there to build and manage this thing. And it's all sorts of different skills. So one of the big areas that we focused on, again, the crown jewel being the network, was really how do we optimize the rollout in New York City versus Kansas? Very, very different matters, even in terms of just getting the permits that allow you to do any of this work. And so this, again, was in line with what mattered most to Verizon. We went in there deep. But as I've been saying, there's a lot more to the picture, and these are the 7 dimensions that I've pulled out, and this is a way that we like to measure companies in terms of their maturity related to their operating model. So I talked a bit about leadership. We're going to talk more about measurement. Not going to get too deep into the organizational model. There's going to be a lot of variation in your companies because some companies are more federated than others. Some like to centralize everything. There's every shade, I think, of data organization and AI organization out there. Creating data literacy and an understanding of data as an asset, data governance, responsible AI. Nick, you were talking about the upcoming release of Domino. Sustainability and scale we're going to go into, and talent and culture. I wish I could cover all of these today, but we're just going to pick on a few of them. On the sustainability and scale side of the equation, this is what I would call a marketecture. You can't really look at it like an architecture. It's kind of a mix. That term is one that I learned from my co-founder, who actually spent a lot of time at IBM Watson. That is, marketecture is a term that IBM liked to use, and I think it actually is a very useful one, because what you have here are a number of different kinds of activities, but also the notion of what needs to be in place if you want to stand up something of scale. And so this was put in place to support not only the digital twin, but many, many other kinds of initiatives. And I thought you would find this interesting because there are a lot of boxes here. There are a lot of boxes here, and I'm sure I left some boxes out. Domino, of course, figured mightily into our architecture as well. I must highlight that. But I'm going to actually now move into what I would consider to be the most important question, the most formidable question for people in this data and AI game. What value are you driving? And do you know how to calculate it? I would have to say this is one of the most treacherous areas, because if you're leading an AI and data strategy, you need to be able to show value. So how do you measure that? So I came up with the notion of this value tree, which really starts at the top, return on equity. And in turn, we're getting really into the numbers of your business, and I'm going to really beseech you to understand your business's numbers. Revenue, operational efficiency, financial leverage. When you start getting to that next layer, you start seeing the levers that can be used to improve those numbers. Customer engagement, pricing, process optimization, workforce optimization, energy optimization. And from there, you can go down. So this is where you start calculating how much impact that you can have. And you can also start having that real dialogue with the business leadership in terms of where do they want you to focus here? What's going to make a difference to the firm?
And now you get into the nitty-gritty. How are you going to measure? And I cannot tell you how many initiatives I've seen leaders embark upon where they never got to the point where they were even establishing the benchmarks that they were beginning with. And so they work on something for a year and they can't really begin to convey that they feel they've been able to accomplish. So you got to start with the benchmarks. You got to measure current state. That's just wisdom. And then you got to figure out how to quantify the tangible benefits. And this is where you're going to want to work with finance. You're going to want to work with the business teams, et cetera, to understand how are you going to measure productivity improvements, cost improvements, improvements in accuracy, improvements in speed, improvements in your risk profile. How are you going to calculate that? And again, it doesn't have to be seen as only your value that you've driven. This all is going to be done in terms of as a team. A whole bunch of people involved, and we'll get into that. And then even harder is that how do you assess the qualitative impact?
Before you embark on your initiatives, try to figure these things out. It will make a world of difference in terms of the perception of your organization. And so now you're beginning to think about implementing. You've identified where you may want to be focusing, but you still have to do an assessment. You want to do a feasibility assessment. You want to take a look at what are the data assets that you're going to have to tame in order to be able to leverage this in your models. You're going to want to understand the complexity and the platform demands, et cetera, and what you're going to find, and this is called a path to value, but it actually turns into what I would call a graph to value, where you're going to identify certain data assets. In this case, it was physical equipment, operational conditions, and IoT sensor data in the land of Verizon. And you're going to find that it actually can drive a number of different areas of value. In this case, predictive maintenance and energy optimization. That's a sweet zone for you. That is you're drawing out your roadmap. That's where you want to begin to put your focus. And then, of course, you're going to have supplemental data included as well. But this graph that I'm describing to you, this notion of the value tree, understanding where you really want to move the lever, and being able to calculate how the lever can be moved, and then figuring out the graph to value, super potent. And it was truly game-changing at Verizon. We drove billions of dollars of value at Verizon. Of course, it's a huge organization, but you move the lever there, it matters. And in addition, I just wanted to highlight that it takes a village. You need to really build a coalition. And I use that word very intentionally. So IT, you may be sitting in IT already, but you want to make sure that your colleagues are all on board in terms of the value that you're all seeking to drive. Information security, compliance, legal, finance, going back to business leadership, executive leadership, and even very importantly, the board. You want to be messaging up to the board. And it's that coalition that's going to make things happen because, again, AI is super, super invasive. And lastly, I'm going to just highlight, this was something that I came to realize certainly at the Federal Reserve, and I see some friends back there, a friend, communicate. At Verizon, I actually stood up a communication office because you have to be advertising the heck out of what you're doing because you are a change agent, and if you are not advertising what's happening and you're not doing outreach and you're not doing training and sending reading materials out there on a continuous basis, if you're silent, no matter how great the work is that you and your team are doing, people are going to assume that you're not getting anything done. And the more that you can actually orientate your communication into, again, those numbers, the stronger you're going to be seen as being. So I'm actually going to wrap up at this point. I hope this was of help to you all. And if I got a question.
Yeah, just a question.
Yeah.
The digital twin looks pretty complicated. How long did it take you to get something?
Again, it's iterative. They're still working on it. But in order to actually, I'd say it took us about 6 months before we had the first iteration. And actually, it's getting easier. I mean, some of what you want to be able to use is synthetic data, and that's becoming a lot easier to obtain and generate than it was even 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago when we began. Sure. Any other questions? Well, thank you.